So the Mamertines looked back to their homeland and requested aid from the greatest power of all, Rome. The Romans were divided on how to react. There were moral as well as practical reasons to deny the request. Arguments for and against the idea were raised, with support for aid coming from backers of the Claudii family, who, coincidentally, held land and power in the south, and arguments against the idea coming from supporters of the Fabii family, who argued Rome should expand north, where they, again coincidentally, held the majority of the land and power. This did not detract from the arguments themselves. It is just interesting to note who embraced what argument and why. The Fabii were quick to point out two important reasons for denying aid, one moral and one practical. Morally, they reminded the Senate of the recent seizure of Rhegium by legionaries just a few years before. In the aftermath of the Pyrrhic Wars, a group of Roman soldiers had taken control of the Greek city which lay in the extreme toe of Italy and declared themselves autonomous oligarchs. The Romans had taken a dim view of this at the time, and in 270 BC retook Rhegium, marching the rebels back to Rome and beheading them in full view of the public. The Fabii argued that for Rome to now come to the aid of a group who so closely mirrored the group from Rhegium would show the Romans to be abject hypocrites. The second point, as succinct as it was practical, went like this. Helping the Mamertines meant fighting the Carthaginians, and fighting the Carthaginians was a really, really bad idea. The Claudii, however, argued that the Carthaginians were already pressing at Rome's doorstep, having taken up positions in Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica, the large islands laying off the Italian coast. If Rome did not do something soon to head off the Carthaginians, Rome would find itself and its Italian empire surrounded by the more powerful Carthaginians. The time to act was now, before Carthage solidified its position. The immediate strategic importance of controlling Messana, and thus the straits between Italy and Sicily, was obvious, but the larger strategic imperative of checking Carthaginian encroachment was just as important. Plus, they said, the Carthaginians were so bogged down trying to pacify Spain that they probably would not even react to a Roman foray into Sicily. On this last count, they were completely mistaken, but in the end, the Claudii, filling the Senate with visions of an easy victory and irresistible Roman expansion, carried the day. The Senate ordered one of the consuls for the year, Appius Claudius, yes, another Appius Claudius, to raise 2 legions and sail for Sicily. But Claudius, recognizing that time was of the essence, dispatched one of his cousins to immediately secure passage for a smaller force on Greek ships. A smaller force could set out at once for Messana and, with a little luck, secure the city before the Carthaginians knew what had occurred. Once Messana was in Roman hands, the consul Claudius would follow with the 2 full legions and relieve the expeditionary force. This advanced Roman brigade landed in Sicily without a hitch and marched to the Mamertines' aid. Upon hearing the news that the Roman army was at the gates, the commander of the Carthaginian garrison immediately began to make preparations for a fight, but seeing the Mamertines welcome the Romans with open arms, realized he was in it in a bad way and withdrew from the city. The conquest of Messana had thus been a bloodless affair, but the ease of victory for the Romans was almost certainly a result of Carthaginian restraint rather than any weakness of arms. The east coast of Sicily was the last outpost of Carthaginian control, and there was no standing orders in place to cover a sudden Roman invasion. The prudent naval commander, seeing the Romans cross the strait, likely decided it was best to leave the small Roman force alone and wait for instructions from home rather than spark a full-scale war by immediately attacking. The Carthaginian Senate was apoplectic when they heard the news of the Roman invasion, and recalled the leader of the Messana garrison and crucified him, literally, for his failure to defend the city. Carthage reacted with far more vigor than the Romans had estimated, and the Carthaginians immediately directed their armies to Messana with orders to nip this Roman menace in the bud. Just as Appius Claudius arrived in Sicily with his 2 legions, the Carthaginian armies reached Messana, and, just like that, the First Punic War was on, whether either side really wanted it or not. Next week, we will get into the guts of the First Punic War, or as it might just as easily be called, the War for Sicily, as all the action takes place on and around the island. There would be triumphs for both sides, but as much as the Second Punic War was defined by great generalship, the First Punic War is actually defined by bumbling, incompetence, and missed opportunities by the leadership of both armies. The Romans would eventually win this sloppily played game, but their victory would do nothing more than guarantee that another, far bloodier conflict would be fought as soon as the two, now mortal enemies, caught their breath. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 20A, The First Punic War. As a way to set up today's episode and recap last week's topic, I would like to start with an extended quote from Sir Nigel Bagnall's The Punic Wars, which sums up the events that led to the First Punic War with perfect brevity. A gang of ex-mercenaries turned brigands seized Messana to exploit its people and its natural resources for their own enrichment. Faced with the threat of falling under the domination of Hiero of Syracuse and losing their privileged status, the Mamertines turned to the Carthaginians for help. Soon finding their arrangement unsatisfactory, they invited the Romans to help them instead. The Romans had recently recovered one of their own cities, Rhegium, from a similar band of adventurers whom they considered so reprehensible that they had taken them to Rome for public execution. But in spite of this, they accepted the Mamertines' invitation and occupied Messana. The temptation to acquire a foothold in Sicily and secure the straits in the face of Carthaginian unpreparedness clearly overcame all moral considerations. It was an example of blatant opportunism. Though they gravely underestimated the consequences, the Romans had the muscle, and they used it. In 264 BC, Rome had dispatched one of its consuls for the year, Appius Claudius, along with 2 legions to Sicily, with the understanding that they were to quickly secure the city of Messana in the northeast corner of the island, and then take what further territory they could. Claudius had been a vocal supporter of invading Sicily, and was positively licking his lips at the thought of the riches and glory he was about to win for himself. He managed to slip by the Carthaginian fleet stationed in the straits between Italy and Sicily, and marched 2 legions to Messana, where he joined the small expeditionary force led by his cousin that was already holding the city for Rome. Upon his arrival, Claudius immediately set about fortifying his position, knowing that despite his claims of easy victory to the Senate, the Syracusans who controlled the southeast quadrant of the island and the Carthaginians who controlled the western half were not going to simply let Rome waltz onto their turf without a fight. He did not have to wait long for a reaction from the 2 major established powers on the island. Upon hearing the news that the Romans had arrived in Sicily, Carthage immediately concluded a treaty with Hiero, the king of Syracuse, and they launched a joint effort to dislodge the interlopers. Hiero marched his army north from Syracuse, and the Carthaginians marched east from their strongholds on the western edge of the island. They met at Messana and made preparations to lay siege to the city. Claudius was outnumbered by the 2 armies, but as he watched his opponents set up their camps, it was obvious they had not yet coordinated their armies. Seizing the initiative, Claudius marched out and attacked Hiero's force first, driving them off with little difficulty. Hiero had no incentive to put up stiff resistance to the Romans. The treaty with his longtime nemesis Carthage was nominal at best, sort of a, well, if you're going to fight the Romans, go ahead, I've got your back. But he had no intention of actually leading the attack, and so, facing the brunt of the Roman offensive with the Carthaginians standing by watching, Hiero prudently withdrew. Better to let the Romans and Carthaginians duke it out than overcommit and risk losing his kingdom if the Romans emerged victorious and came looking for revenge. The quickness of Hiero's defeat allowed Claudius to wheel his army around and attack the Carthaginians immediately. In the first major engagement between the 2 powers, Rome got the upper hand, and the Carthaginians were forced back. But it was an orderly, tactical retreat, not the mad, chaotic dash of outright defeat. Followed up their victory by marching south on Syracuse. Claudius knew it was essential to neutralize the powerful Greek city-state, and after Hiero's poor showing outside Messana, Claudius was confident he could spook the king into retreating, at the very least ensuring his neutrality in the fight that was sure to come against the Carthaginians. Claudius began setting up for a siege of Hiero's city, but it is likely that the entire operation was pure theater. 2 legions with no naval support was not nearly enough manpower to take a city as strong as Syracuse, but Claudius was hoping that Hiero would deal anyway. Though he had no real desire to fight the Romans and every reason to align himself with them against the Carthaginians, the king of Syracuse was not about to capitulate to a few thousand soldiers who may be gone by winter, never to return. So Hiero remained secure in his city, refused to negotiate, and waited for the Romans to withdraw. Knowing that the legions were vulnerable out in the open to a Carthaginian attack, Claudius satisfied himself that Hiero would not bargain and marched his 2 legions back to Messana, where they would remain for the winter. The next year, 263 BC, the Romans decided to commit themselves more fully to the Sicilian invasion. The operation of the previous year had essentially been a private campaign waged by Appius Claudius. He had raised the 2 legions himself and conducted the campaign without any input from the Senate. But now, what had been a personal adventure authorized by the Senate was about to become state policy. Recognizing that the quick and easy road to victory in Sicily had been a mirage all along, the Senate now made their plans with a broad, long-term strategy in mind. The first step was to eliminate Hiero as a threat. If Syracuse could not be made into an ally, then at the very least he had to agree to stay out of the fight. With this in mind, both consuls for the year, each in command of 2 legions, were sent to Sicily with instructions to march on Syracuse and force Hiero to the table. As the 4 legions moved south from Messana, for now the Roman home base on the island, they attacked towns allied with Syracuse. None of these cities were a match for Rome, and after forcing a few to capitulate under arms, the rest quickly announced their surrender without a fight. When the Romans arrived at the gates of Syracuse this time, they brought with them a much better hand than the inside straight Claudius had bluffed the year before. Isolated, cut off from his supply lines, and facing 4 full legions, eternally pragmatic Hiero agreed to meet with the consuls and talk terms. The king was delighted by what the Romans offered. He was to keep his existing kingdom intact and even be granted control of a few additional cities in exchange for aiding Rome in their impending showdown with Carthage. Hiero jumped at the deal. He had long wanted the North Africans expelled from his island, and the Romans stood a very good chance of doing just that. Plus, if he helped the Romans now, he would secure the territorial integrity of his kingdom, which even neutrality might cost him if Rome won without his help. There was always the possibility the Romans may renege down the road, but that was for another day. For now, he pledged himself fully and completely to Rome. In the end, the Romans did not renege on their deal, and Hiero was allowed to keep his Sicilian kingdom intact. The alliance between Hiero and Rome would last for 50 years until the old king's death in 215 BC, and proved to be decisive as the Romans transitioned from an Italian to a Mediterranean power. Hiero essentially midwifed the birth of the wider Roman Empire, forever standing by Rome's side as it fought its decades-long war against Carthage, and forever there with aid and comfort after every Roman setback. Without the support of Hiero, the Romans would never have been able to accomplish what they did, and the king was rewarded with the gift of unchallenged sovereignty over his kingdom. There was a lesson implicit in the pact with Hiero that the Romans followed to great success and ignored